So welcome back. I hope you guys had a good break. So I have to tell you, I'm really happy that we're having the next conversation. I've been happy about all the conversations that we're having, but I really care deeply about this next one. I think many of us in the field for the last couple of years have been really coming to understand the real deep importance of bringing together our learning, mutual learning from the abuse of older adults field and the domestic violence fields. And so that is what our esteemed next panel is going to do, between them, with us, for us. So I'd like to introduce our three esteemed speakers. First, to my immediate left is Dr. Peter Jaffe. Peter is the academic director of the Centre for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western in London, Ontario. He has played an instrumental, and I might add international role, but an instrumental role in promoting a national forum for domestic violence death review committees in Canada, has been a very strong advocate for that. Peter will speak about emerging gaps and trends identified in 4 cases of domestic homicide and suicide of couples aged 60 plus, reviewed in the 2012 Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee report. This is really important because these are new trends that we're starting to see. Secondly, April, you have met April already. I wanted to just add, again, in addition to being part of the evaluation team for our project, that she has contributed to the National Abuse of Older Adults field with writing on promising approaches on abuse prevention in both mainstream and First Nations communities, innovative tool development for intervention within Indigenous communities, that would be the Being Least Intrusive tool, and contributed to a draft national strategy for elder abuse prevention, and a number of other things that she'll be highlighting in her talk. And thirdly, I wanted to also introduce Barb McQuarrie, the community director of CREVAC at Western University in London. I did mention yesterday, but I think it's really important that we celebrate our people that are making such a huge contribution. She was awarded the Order of Ontario in 2015 for 30 years leadership and dedication to ending violence against women and children. Barb is currently leading the development of an international network on domestic violence in the workplace and co-led the first national workplace domestic violence study in Canada. And Barb's going to work with us on the domestic violence scenarios that are part of our package. So over to you, Peter, and thank you guys so much.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I'm about to engage you in a very sobering conversation about domestic homicides. And just to begin, I'm going to be reviewing literature that we've gathered from the Office of the Chief Coroner of Ontario, looking at domestic homicide tragedies and looking at lessons that we could learn, and particularly focus on the issue of older women and their vulnerability in these circumstances. Although I'm presenting, this work was really made possible by a number of associates that you see on the screen, Marcy, Catherine, and Brianna. Catherine, who's here, and Brianna is our graduate students working with me, looking at some of this data. Just to put the work into context, Ontario has the first Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, where the Office of the Chief Coroner brought together a multidisciplinary committee to review every domestic homicide in the province. In Ontario, every year, there's somewhere between 35 and 40 domestic homicides. And the question that the coroner's office wants to really answer is, were these homicides predictable and preventable? And if so, what recommendations could be made to prevent a tragedy in similar circumstances in the future? It's very much, when I try to explain to my kids what I do when I go to these meetings, I said it's like looking at a plane crash and looking for a black box, trying to understand who knew what, when, In the same way, when a plane crashes, all of us who ever go on a plane want to make sure we know why it happened. You know, when a plane goes down, I remember a number of years ago, there was a plane that went down in Buffalo in freezing rain, and everybody's, wants to know before they get on that airline again, what happened. Well, in that crash, they found out the pilots had no experience actually flying in freezing rain. They found that one of the pilots was getting paid at the same level they would have gotten paid if they worked at Taco Bell in Buffalo. They couldn't actually afford to live in the city. They actually had to sleep in the airport. They found all kinds of issues. And then a report came out, and that report obviously goes to all airlines and is made public. So I use that as an example. No matter what happens, you want to make sure that this information is shared so tragedies can be prevented in the future. It's the same thing with domestic homicides. Rather than just having a story that's buried on the back pages of a newspaper somewhere, these things need to be properly investigated, particularly looking at what are the risk factors, what are the trends, what are the issues we need to learn in terms of public awareness, training. So these are very important issues. Actually, when you walk into the office of the chief coroner, there's a big sign on the wall, which is quite sobering. It says, "We speak for the dead to protect the living." We speak for the dead to protect the living, which really says it all in terms of the importance of making sure that there's lessons learned from these tragedies. One of the things that the average person on the street believes that somehow you can't do anything to prevent these tragedies. Domestic violence are acts of passion, moments of madness, who knew? The reality is quite different. Most domestic homicides are predictable and preventable. Domestic homicides are the most predictable of all homicides. At least 3/4 of the cases have 7 or more well-known risk markers that all of you would be familiar with. So there are issues around a recent separation, a prior history of violence, prior threats, stalking, and mental health issues in the perpetrator. These aren't issues that happen out of the blue. And what the research suggests more and more is that this information is often held by friends, family, co-workers, frontline professionals. Often in these cases, in general with families, the person who usually knows the most but has the least training around these issues are family doctors and teachers who have students in their classroom. Students or children are usually the canaries in the coal mine dealing with domestic violence, and usually teachers are the first to see these warning signs. But unless you have teachers or doctors with training around these issues, they really don't know what it means or what to do when they do recognize these factors. Actually, I have 4 boys. My oldest son went to an unnamed medical school in Ontario, and in 4 years he got 2 hours on the issues of child abuse and domestic violence. Luckily, we have family dinners where I bring along PowerPoint slides, and it does make dinner more formal. But he's also married. He fell in love with a resident, and so his wife is also a physician. So I do a presentation for 2 of them, and I hope the message gets through. But to me, it's always a sobering reminder in trying to do this during dinner, because he always says, "Dad, there's so many issues, you have no idea about the number of notices I get, memos, mandatory training, there's so many things I have to deal with. This is one of many issues." And I always say, "Yes, but if you want dessert, you're going to have to listen to the rest of this presentation." So the message that I pass on to him and I'm sharing with you is how well known this information is or should be, but often people don't really have the understanding about what it all means. If you look at the multiple risk factors, again, these are things that all of you would be familiar with just in general. I mean, being good friends, neighbors, professionals. How many of you work in hospital settings? Get a show of hands. So again, depending on the setting you're working in, for example, if you're a police officer in Ontario, domestic violence is the most dangerous call, both to police and to family members. If you're a police officer in Ontario, police standards now require that you complete a risk assessment. So if you go to a scene where there's domestic violence, You have to complete a risk assessment on domestic violence, and you have to share that information. You have to engage the individual. Depending on the level of training, you're obviously going to be engaging with victim services, looking at safety planning, looking at risk reduction with the perpetrator. So there's standards across different professionals, and police and professionals in the justice system have the highest onus and the most rigorous standards. But it's hit and miss for the rest of us. You know, if you happen to be in a hospital where there's good protocols in place, you're going to be engaged in this. But the reality, for example, I just looked at protocols within one hospital where there's all this information about suicide, but there's absolutely nothing about homicide. And most of the cases we review, individuals have not been engaged in any kind of risk assessment whatsoever. Questions, when people are depressed, professionals, mental health professionals are trained to ask questions about suicidal ideation or suicidal threats, but they don't ask questions about homicidal ideation or homicidal threats, and I'll come back to that point. But what you can see on the slide is these cases don't happen out of the blue in general. It's different when you get to older couples, but in general, they don't happen out of the blue, and there's usually well-known risk markers. How do domestic homicides differ with older adults? And by way of our research, there was a major study out of Quebec, at the Quebec Coroner's Office, and we wanted to do our research similar to what they'd done in Quebec. In Quebec, they defined older adults as 55 years of age. That was sort of their definition of older. So again, it's one of the issues, actually, if you're looking in the research within older adults or elder population, the research varies as to what the definition is, 65, 55, 60, 65, it varies. I know 55 seemed awfully young to me in terms of this kind of research. I know that my student, Brianna, when she did her proposal meeting, she did it with a young 55-year-old professor who took great offense that he was now in this, defined in this population. I thought she might not get through the proposal meeting, but so for our discussion, it's 55 years of age and older. And just putting this work in context, the older population actually has the lowest rate of domestic violence. So there are issues. For example, if you look at Stats Canada, one report had over 3,000 individuals based on a national study reported spousal violence, but it's the lowest of all age categories. And we know that older women have different experiences about domestic violence, even considering domestic violence as an issue. I mean, if you're in your 20s and 30s, or particularly if you're in 20s, you will have gone to a high school where dating violence and domestic violence and abuse is part of the curriculum now. That it's hard to either be a student in high school or a student in a college and university where you're not inundated with campaigns about abuse and bullying and violence, including violence in intimate relationships. So it's part of the regular discourse. I think with older women, even thinking about what abuse means and whether or not they have been violated in some way, it's defined quite differently. So we know that there's a higher level of denial, a difference in even defining what the issue is, and certainly a higher level of dependency and vulnerability in even coming forward. You know, if your intimate partner who's also your caregiver is the one abusing you, it's obviously very difficult to make those disclosures in terms of thinking about the possible consequences. You know, what's going to happen to you? What happens after the police come to your house? You know, what happens if your husband caregiver is removed from the home? Who's going to look after you? Where do you go? What are the implications? They're quite profound. So clearly there's very different issues with an older population. If you look at domestic homicides with older adults, it's clearly there's less homicides proportionally with this population. Most often, couples where there's domestic homicide, they're intact rather than separated. We're generally not looking at women killing men, we're looking at men killing women. So it's always a sober reflection, and again, it may not be needed with this audience, But just as an aside, if you're looking at domestic homicides in Ontario, for the most part, you're looking at men killing women, usually at the point of separation or shortly thereafter. It's about a 4 or 5 to 1 ratio. When women kill men, it's usually in self-defense or after there's been a history of violence. And this is an uncomfortable discussion. It doesn't mean that men are abused. There are women who are perpetrators of violence. These cases do exist. But for the most part, when we're talking about domestic homicide, it's usually about men killing women. And it's an uncomfortable discussion, not within a sensitive and thoughtful and well-informed audience as this, but in the general population, people get very, very defensive dealing with that reality. As a matter of fact, men don't even come to conferences to talk about abuse. If I look around this room, I'm reminded that I've been at this for 40 years, and for 40 years, when you have conferences on abuse or violence, it's usually women who come. And although men are equally invited, they're not here. So just a reflection on why that is. I remember giving a talk at, I have mentioned 4 boys. One of my boys, they had a day for parents on abuse and violence and media violence and sexual violence and dating violence, all forms of violence, children living with domestic violence. I got invited to his elementary school for an evening for parents. 150 parents showed up. There was 10 fathers and 140 mothers. And I got invited a week after that to Montreal. It was an international conference on domestic violence in children. They had 300 people, and there was about 25 men. One of them was actually married to the shelter director, and he said he was only there because he was married to the shelter director, and he was asked to take pictures. And I said, "We're all the men." And he said, "Well, it's not really our issue, it's a women's issue." And I said, "I'm going to talk to your wife about this." And and I was quite surprised, but to me, I've been at this 40 years later. It still saddens me that I come to a conference with 120 people and there's just a few good men, and somehow it's the responsibility of women to continue to talk about these issues. So clearly, one of our recommendations, really has to be to find ways to engage boys and men in this discussion. Let me just talk a bit about what our research has told us about this, and it's very consistent with other researchers. We looked at 3 groups. Couples were, both of them were 26 years of age or younger. Couples who were 30 to 50, and couples both were 55 years of age and older. And we compared them on risk factors and who knew what in advance of the homicide. And just one thing that was quite striking, the percentage of cases that are murder-suicide is significantly higher. So the light blue or the couples 55 years of age and older. So there's a very distinct difference that if you're an older couple, not only you're more likely to be an intact couple, but you're also more likely to be involved in a murder-suicide committed by the husband, and obviously in all the cases. We don't have any older couples where the wife is the perpetrator of the homicide. So even the pattern, so understanding the links between suicide and homicide is significant. If you look at risk factors, overall, almost in every category, first of all, there's less risk factors, so there's less warning signs with older couples, and I'll come back to this point. But of all the warning signs that do exist, male depression is a significant warning sign. So if you look at the last grouping, significant difference with depression as a risk factor for couples, for the man, the perpetrator who's 55 years of age or older, which is really critical in terms of mental health professionals training, getting mental health professionals to actually ask those questions about what's being considered. And I'll come back to that in a case illustration in a moment. The other risk factors, for almost every risk factor, being an older couple makes us less likely to be a risk factor. And let me go ahead to probably the most important thing. If you look at a minimum number of risk factors, as I mentioned, for the vast majority of cases, there's multiple risk factors, 7 or more risk factors. For example, 26 years of age and younger, 7 or more risk factors are present in 91% of the cases, but very few of the cases who are 55 years of age and older. So the thing that stands out with the older population, although there are some distinct risk factors, for the most part, there's less. So for example, if you're a police officer in Ontario responding to a call, a distress call, dealing with either domestic violence or dealing potentially with mental health issues or physical health issues, some sort of police call, if you're looking at doing a formal risk assessment, you really have to think about very different issues for an older population compared to a younger population, because there's less risk factors and also very distinct risk factors. For example, for an older couple, there's less likely to be prior police involvement, warning signs with family, warning signs with friends, warning signs with co-workers, given there's going to be a higher population that's retired, or information that neighbors have. So one of the realities of being older potentially is having less people who may be aware of the depth of what the struggles are, or understanding the possibility of a homicide. So isolation of the elderly and less people being involved and engaged is obviously an important risk factor. If you look at the themes, in going through the actual cases, they actually fall into 3 major categories. The first category is major mental health issues. So you have perpetrators who have significant mental health issues, depression, as well as other issues, and the homicide is clearly connected to the mental health and the depth of the mental health issues. So people are clearly concerned about the perpetrator, but they don't see the perpetrator necessarily being dangerous. And just one comment I'll make, this is based in reviewing over 200 homicides. One of the things we see overall, over and over again, is that people like to put cases into neat categories, that either you're bad or you're mad, but somehow we don't combine these categories. We don't conceptualize people as having multiple problems, in that there are mental health issues, and that's what's being treated, but they're also violent and dangerous, certainly when they're not taking their medication, certainly when they're not being properly supervised or monitored. So one of the key things we see over and over again is people that are working with an individual only see them in one dimension as having a mental health issue, but they don't see the potential for domestic violence or domestic homicide. So we need to expand our thinking in this area. Another major category are cases that seem to happen out of the blue, where the individual is a caregiver, and the issues are around this person's belief that a murder-suicide is going to end the suffering for one or both of them. So we have probably a third of the cases where either the husband or the husband and the wife have serious physical and medical issues, which are going from bad to worse, and the perpetrator believes that killing her or killing both of them will be some form of relief. And then we have another third of the cases that are where there is a history of domestic violence, and it's much clear how the final homicide links clearly to the domestic violence. And sort of just graphically, those 3 categories really are the major ones that represent domestic homicides within Ontario. Let me just talk briefly, before I turn over to the other panelists, about what are the implications. Well, the first one is the need for unique risk assessment, risk management strategies. And I'll just give you a case illustration without naming too many of the facts. So, unnamed hospital, large hospital somewhere in Ontario. Husband shows up with his wife. He has health problems, but she has health problems that are getting worse. At the point of intake, he talks about the possibility of a double suicide. He calls it a double suicide. And so that's noted somewhere. An assessment is made about that comment, so that comment hasn't been lost on the professionals involved. And when I'm talking about a large hospital, you have multiple professionals. If you consider everybody from nursing to psychiatry, social work, everybody's involved with the family and sees a part of it. The comments about a potential double suicide, which really is a homicide-suicide, talk about that is right away reduced because he's such a dedicated caregiver. So because there's no history of domestic violence, because he's such a dedicated caregiver, the possibility really isn't even considered. And matter of fact, when it is momentarily considered, it's dismissed. Although I can find in reviewing, and again, every domestic homicide we do, for the most part, there's multiple agencies and systems involved. The average domestic homicide, there's somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 pieces of paper. So just so for those of you not familiar with the Coroner's Act, when somebody dies, the coroner wants to understand why it happened. If there's a coroner's investigation, inquest, or death review, the coroner sends the police out, and the police get access to everybody who's had any involvement. So you go to the local psychiatrist who says this is confidential. They get told by the police, under the Coroner's Act, it's not confidential. If someone has died, the coroner has a right to investigate. So the Children's Aid file, whoever has a file, whoever has notes about that individual, the coroner's office gets access to that information. So the average death review might involve as much as 1,500 to 2,000 pages of information about the individual. So when I talk about going through the hospital file, you can see all these people being involved. And there's some discussion about caregiver burnout, that, lack of resources, lack of support, isolation. So there's all these issues that put the caregiver at risk for burnout, but no one's looking at the fact that there already has been a direct comment made about a double suicide, and in fact that creates a very high level of risk. And again, it's different, and the point I'm trying to make, it's different with an older population than it is with a younger couple being involved in these circumstances. So clearly the implications that we'll certainly come back to as a panel, what are the unique risk assessment and risk management strategies? The key issues are not a domestic violence history. So if you look at the general population, if you're 50 years of age and under, the risk factors are a prior history of domestic violence, threats, a separation, actual or pending separation. Those are significant risk factors. Stalking, harassing. With an older population, there are very different risk factors that need to inform us. And obviously the last implication is the need for public and professional awareness, that when these things happen, people say, well, I was worried about them, I was worried about suicide, but I never pictured a homicide. So when you talk to friends and family afterwards, the signs are all there related to risk of an older couple, but it's not necessarily seen as a risk to harm the victim in this circumstances. It's seen more as depression. So broadly speaking, the implications are really around changing our conception of risk assessment and risk management, certainly for perpetrators who are also caregivers, looking at what are the key risk factors and the key issues around victim vulnerability, and what do we need to better inform the broad public, neighbors, friends, and family, but also professionals engaged with older couples. I'll leave my formal comments there, and I'll look forward to questions and our discussion during the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Great. Good morning again, everybody. I have to say I was sitting here just reflecting that either I was the meat in a sandwich between these two distinguished workers from the Center for Research and Education Against Violence Against Women and Children, or maybe I was the thorn between two roses, or any of the above. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about some of the observations that I've made over the last while, because I've been involved, and I'm currently still involved with 4 or 5 different projects at the same time that are looking at the intersections between the fields of domestic violence and abuse of older adults or elder abuse. What I'm going to do in the next few minutes is just pull us back a little bit into some sort of systemic analysis, I guess, of 2 systems, and want to have us think about what a third option would be, because I think we're on the brink of figuring out how to either come together with the 2 systems or develop something else that fills more of the needs that are seen for the older adult population. And what I'm also doing is moving down the path that Margaret showed us of the individual, family, community, society. So what I'm talking about is at the level kind of between the community and society part. It's how we conceive of ways of doing things that might fit more needs. So I'm going to talk about some projects. I'm going to talk about the learning that I've had from the projects. I'm going to talk about what I see as intersections now between the 2 fields. And I'm going to talk about some possibilities and recommendations, what it is that I would do, and that in conversations with colleagues, what they think would be helpful in moving things together in a different way. So my position is a unique one. I'm often called on to be the person that scans fields, but I'm not of the fields. My background is in cultural anthropology and tertiary education in some ways, and also human relations. And I work as a management consultant. I don't work as a service provider in these fields, but I work as an observer. So I get hauled in by my friends and colleagues as a person to say, oh, look at that, and look at that over there, and oh, did you see what was happening in Winnipeg? That's pretty good too. And some of that's been published through the CNPEA. Some of it is just in my head and floating around, and often that's the beginning point for other projects. And in this case, I've been pulled into other projects to look at promising practices. The projects that I'm working on right now there's 4. The first one is the Atira Women's Society in Vancouver, which is a significant feminist-driven organization that's looking at better ways of doing housing for older women fleeing violence. And we've just finished a pan-Canadian project through New Horizons, the same kind of funding as for this project. And there's going to be a report which is based on participation and feminist methodology across the country, pulling together the executive directors and workers in transition houses, safe houses, second stage houses, and so on. So it looks at things from within the domestic violence against women field, and it identifies practices that have been going on for some time, quite brilliant practices. They've never been written down. So this is the first time that we know of in the country that these have been written down. Significant report then. This is groundbreaking stuff in a way, because of the way it was done. High level of collaboration, because some of us from the older adult field were brought in through a contract with the Canadian Centre for Elder Law, and I worked for them. And because we tried to create the conversations that matter over time, over distance, to create a view of what's going on. This view is entirely from within that sector, but we have lots to learn. And that sector has lots to learn from us as well. That project will be revealed very soon. It'll be launched by Atira, so watch for that. If you're interested in getting the report from that project, let me know, and I'll make sure to get your email, and we'll get that to you. During that project, there was lots of challenges with collaboration. And that's probably no no issue that you haven't run into before. But it really led me to think about ways of doing things differently and doing things more completely, perhaps. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The Older Women's Dialogue has been run for the past 2 years through provincial and federal funding through the Centre for Elder Law in BC. And it's a provincial and regional project, but it's really significant because it's gone on for a couple of years because of the depth of engagement with what we might call marginalized groups, marginalized older women, and people that we sometimes call hard to reach. That just means we don't know how to reach them, and it means that we see them as on the edges of something and that they're not part of us. So there was a lot of work went into how do you authentically engage people, and how do you build enough trust that people will talk to you when they're people who have been pushed to the edges, people who carry the most oppression, you might say. And I think we've done a fairly good job of doing that. The themes that are emerging are all the themes that we've heard here. The language is a bit different, but safety and the amount of oppression that goes on when you're an older woman really have come through. Now, there's initial project report is out on the first year or so of the project, and there'll be another one following shortly. This is significant because it's helping to develop voice for older women, and because it talked directly to older women. And I have to say, they were stunning, powerful, joyful, and grief-stricken conversations that we had. People did not hold back, and all of that is part of the picture. The third thing I'm working on this very minute, actually, along with Krista James from the Canadian Centre for Elder Law and Raisa Dixon, who is a researcher there, is a journal article for the Elder Abuse and Neglect Journal, which is coming out. They're having a special issue on older women. It'll be out in September. And it'll be notable because they've never done anything like this before. So you might want to take note of that. We've been invited as apparently the only people in Canada that have been invited to be part of that journal issue because of the work both on the Atira Project and the Older Women's Dialogue. The notable thing about that is that we're doing it collaboratively across our different professions, and that we'll be pulling in some stuff about jurisdictional things you have to take into account through the legal systems in our country, but also some of our ideas on if there's a third model of ways to do things in this field, some hints as to what that might be, and look at the literature that exists in that. And it's also suggesting that an overall meta view that we might take in the country, in both fields, is one of a pro-aging feminist plus, we're calling it, methodology, which means that you use those lenses, you add in all the intersectionality that Margaret's been talking about and that the Centre works with all the time. It's quite a complex way of looking at things, and we don't even know what it means. We're just suggesting it, actually. But we do know that we have the capacity to develop within those ideas. The fourth initiative I'm working on is this one. And I have to say, in terms of an exemplar of collaboration and of the stretch geographically across this country, and of trying to bridge the two fields, that this is a notable project in itself. The level of collaboration with the community of practice, bringing together about 40 people across the country, it's been some of the best collaboration I've ever seen. One of my academic disciplines is collaboration and partnershiping and relations where there's less friction and more opportunities, like Sharon talked about. And this project is one that gets high marks, for me at least, in how that has been done. So that is significant, and as a model of ways of doing things where you're spanning geography, spanning concepts, spanning practices, it's a very good one. So Some thumbs up. The learning from the projects, because I go through the same processes we've been going through with you in the last couple of days about what are your ideas, how do you pull them together, how are they divergent, how are they convergent, what does it mean, and the so what is exactly the same process that I and my colleagues use in our practice. So we look at what is the learning, what worked, what didn't work. We're critical friends to each other about figuring that out. The time investment for relationship building in any project where you actually want to create not just adaptive change, but generative change, this must happen. This is a message for funders and designers of projects. I don't think any of you would disagree with this, and most of you I've worked with, it's been under these conditions where we put in the time investment in the beginning parts of the project so that we can grow in a somewhat organic, I see some nodding here, somewhat organic way. It's painful, it's confusing, high degrees of uncertainty. You have to have high degrees of trust to bridge that. And as well, we're translating for one another across professional lines, across silos, always. Painstaking work, but worth it. Developing a common understanding of collaboration. In some of the projects that I referenced just now, we thought we were working with high levels of collaboration, but there was like one group that was thinking this and one group that was thinking that, and within each group they were collaborating highly. Across the groups, we weren't. So you have to think very carefully about what the common understanding is. You have to have peer relationships developed early on where both sets of people get to have some influence on the ways of working and the terms of engagement. In this context, ground rules become the platform that you must work from, commonly developed ground rules. Sounds simple, it's not, and it's profound if you don't do it. Loads of communication. And just at the point where you're getting really irritated about another email, another teleconference, another side conversation, another regional conversation. Does this sound familiar? That's the point where the real work is happening. So you need emotional endurance to get through that, to understand that the persistence is what it's about, actually, and the irritation and the discomfort means the process is working. But it's a time when things can fly apart, too. So getting that social reassurance that you're on the right track is really important. Developmental evaluations I've recently got into in the last 3 years, that's what holds some of these tenuous relationship building and capacity building projects together. Because you have a chance to look frequently at what the heck is going on. And certainly in this initiative, we've been involved as a project group in doing that. So we step outside of the process, we step outside of what the product is, and is this going to work at all? We suspend that and take a look at what's going on. What are we feeling? What are we seeing? How does that impact what we're doing? How do we grow the next stage? And that's what's happened with this initiative. It takes a lot of trust to be able to do that. The risks feel really high. They're not actually really high if you stay in the process, but it feels very risky. But it's a quite authentic way to work, I think. But having the evaluation as you go along to kind of keep things on track, you get better questioning out of that, so your evaluation questions are more targeted to what you're doing, and reveal the reality of people's experiences within the field as well in a totally different way. So, 2 systems at least. Here's an intersection, or a series of intersections, which is more like what we're talking about. You notice there's great traffic flow up here. People are going. We don't know where they're going. We don't know where they've come from. We know they're not running into each other. So that could be quite a good thing if we could identify in our own systems what that pattern was, and we don't know that yet. More often, the way that we feel about this is that there's too much traffic. Nobody knows where to go in the traffic circle because we're not used to those. And there's all these guys coming up. There's that pressure of need that we feel all the time, and that can stop this other process in its tracks because we panic at that point. So we have to figure out how to do this. Now, just to really confuse you, I've got a complex diagram. I'm not expecting you to read this all or to, you actually know this, but this is just a beginning depiction of what two fields look like and where the intersections are. On the right is the older adult field, no, on the left, the older adult field, on the, I'm seeing it backwards. That's why I need colleagues, right? The blue circle is the younger women, the experience of younger women. And remember, in my projects, I'm only talking about women because it's being driven at the minute from that part of our population. This would be the response of the violence against women field in all its aspects, both shelter-driven services and community services around that. Where certain things happen, where there's probably gender-based violence and where power dynamics around intimate partnership are what's going on. Often women are encouraged to leave relationships for all kinds of reasons, safety amongst them and danger. And the practice here is grown mostly by women from the grassroots up and out of need and out of first and second and third wave feminism, really. Contrast that to the other side, and you notice we're moving through the life course now to older adult women, where there's gender but also other kinds of violence, a range of dynamics that happen, and a range of relationships that are part of this. So the complexity in some ways grows. Not to say that intimate partner violence is not complex, but now we're talking about a stack of different kinds of potential dynamics going on. Women in these situations are in other kinds of relationships as well that they don't want to leave. So encouraging women to leave relationships may not be the path that needs to happen. Then we bring in chronic health concerns and aging, effects of aging, impact of aging, what that means to people, and accessibility needs. And this is within a practice developed by health social workers, gerontologists, and seniors-driven community organizations. So we're seeing some differences here. We know there's overlap, that's in the middle, and we've defined what some of that is. But really, if we're going to serve all the needs of older women, and that's coming up through the projects I've been working with, we need to move those two circles somehow closer together, or we need to create a third option that encapsulates that. This is another way of saying the same thing. You'll notice in the younger women part of the life course here that the legal system and the enforcement systems are the intervening systems, mainly on the other side, health, adult protection, social services, and so on. So two different systems. Do they always talk to each other? Do we have a way of starting those conversations, more to the point? And in the middle, there is an intersection where definitely we need both systems to be there. Now, if we're going to just have adaptive change in this country, that would be to look at the two systems from within them, probably, and say, what can we be doing differently to serve our population? So for the violence against women part, it would be, getting our facilities up to snuff in terms of accessibility. Could be training the staff on aging. So the Atira report now is going to come out of entirely that block on the left, and some of those things are kind of the themes that came out. On the right, what do we do with the other system or the other system of systems? Well, learning to flag violence differently, and Peter spoke to that in terms of, how do you get the information, how do you respond in an effective way to that information? Having safety practices that make us feel better about having vulnerable older women go to the hospital, for instance. Beyond that, we can ask for those things to happen, and advocates do ask right now for those things to happen within the systems. And that's one level of work, but beyond that, we need to have coalitions of some kind that cover both eventualities, and we need to have cross-training of staff One of the best ways to create collaboration and to create the junctures and the conversations that we can work from is by getting two sets of professionals together in the same room, or multiple sets, as in this room, and doing the same training, and having one set deliver to the other set, and then have a reciprocal kind of thing happening. How do we align the services better with the needs, though? This would be a generative change where you're actually changing some social conditions, perhaps social norms as well, by doing a change that's not just adaptive. Well, I think that we need to look at the collective, and that's been a theme that's been emerging in the last 2 days, for sure. We need a coalition to do that, probably. We need to look at peer relationships. If we're working from different fields, who holds the power? It comes back to power dynamics. How do we work with that in a way that all voices can be heard and that things can still happen? How do we do that, and what do we do? Well, we can look to the CRN movement, amongst other network movements, for how to do that, because the how has been every bit as important as the what, as the activities. We often feel really pressured to have more and more activities, more and more service. Unless we have the how of doing that, it's not sustainable. Coordination at all levels, and I know lots of you are involved right now in trying to do that. And de-siloing, that's what this initiative is doing. So, how do we get there? Well, I'm suggesting a large collaboration of some kind, where we use a meta view, which would be the pro-aging, feminist plus, or whatever we decide to call it, kind of lens. We do extreme partnershiping. That's like extreme sports, okay? So it's kind of like you're going to jump out of the plane with all your friends. You're going to have one big parachute. Who gets to yank the cord to make that happen? Well, so it's taking some risks. And it's doing partnershiping in the best way possible with the best technology of participation that we know. That technology is out there. Increasing in each area, in each field, what's called the narrow radius of trust. So within the violence against women field, generally organizations and individuals, staff and policymakers and so on, trust each other. There is friction when you get to the edges of the field. And there's reasons for that, but we need to work with it. Build social capital within the fields themselves. That's what you've been trying to do with this initiative across the country with individuals and with organizations, but we need to do it with the fields. Okay. Solve problems that arise in that collaboration within the process. Trust the process enough, trust yourselves enough, that you stay within the process that's agreed. Don't step outside and bring in a different power dynamic to run things. Anybody had any experience of that recently? Yeah. This all has budget implications. Funders in the room, please note, putting a lot of money into this in the beginning, making sure these conditions are there, pays off hugely in the end. This is not rocket science, right? And this is not unknown to any of you. Many of you run your projects like that already. We're just talking on a large scale. We need to do it. So I have two recommendations for you and a challenge. The first recommendation is let's get together some thought leaders, so to speak, in the two fields. Discuss the ways to work. Do the terms of engagement. Decide what lenses might be useful to use and how to do that. And co-design a project. The project would be larger dialogues between the fields, identifying the common ground, identifying can we build a model. I don't know what the third option is. There's real implications for what it could be. Why don't we come together as two fields to build that model? Use the networks that we have, and use the spectrum of relationship that exists already in those networks. Use it as an asset. Do joint training, and more joint training, and more joint training. Make it all joint training, really. And of course, to keep track, the developmental evaluation. Okay, so who wants to think this through? Anybody want to? Okay. Good. We've got at least a dozen people that want to play in this field. This is very good. And here's the invitation. The Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse is developing a key topic system on their message board on a new website. Krista James has asked me to facilitate a beginning discussion on how to get the two fields together through that system. So if you're interested in being part of that, talk to me. We'll make a list of who we should contact, and let's together go on this ride through time and space that will result in something different. Thank you.
Good. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to see some more scenarios. And as we move into these scenarios, I want you to think about everything that Peter has said, everything that April has said, but beyond that, all the discussions that we've had at the conference. So about understanding abuse, about how social norms influence our actions, and about how, as bystanders, we have a role to play. So,
Oh, hey! I thought you'd already left. I was in the back. Isn't it your turn to drive us to the ring today, or did I get it wrong again?
No, you're right. I'm just not up to it today. I'm sorry, I'm just not up to it today.
Okay.
I should have called you.
Are you sure? Because we need all the practice we can get before the next bond spill.
I can't.
Okay. Call me. As soon as you can.
okay, I'm not going to talk very much, I hope. I'm going to ask people to go up to the microphones, and we'll start out, just talk about what you saw in that little short scenario. What do you make of that situation? How do you understand that situation? Any brave souls?
I think the point that I took from it is she was asking for help without asking for help by showing the bruise
Showing the bruise.
and not making a big deal out of it, but kind of call me when you can. So that was her way of reaching out for help.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else think anything about that? Have any thoughts about that? It's a complicated moment, right? Was it maybe not the right time for her to say, things aren't going well in my life?
Being in the minority, I felt a need to stand up and speak on behalf of men. I saw terror in that woman's eyes and feeling trapped and a lot of emotion that really kind of said little, but I felt a lot. So it's that's what I saw, is the subtle reaching, well, not so subtle, displaying the bruise and the man with his behaviors in the background. And it appeared to me that the woman was trapped in a situation, and yeah, it was quite disturbing. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, John. Anybody else see terror in her eyes? Okay, so thinking about all the discussions we've had about bystanders intervening, what would you do in this situation? And again, you know, I don't think there's a roadmap. I don't think there's right answers, wrong answers. I think these are the kinds of things that we need to have discussions about. How would we respond if we went to the door and we saw our friend with the bruise and her partner yelling at her in the background, tell whoever it is to go away? Sure. Can you go to the mic?
I'm kind of short, so I'm going to lower it a little bit. Within our agency at Six Nations Long-Term Care, we have a process and policy that we have in place when we approach a elder and go into the homes. We always go back, report back to the manager, and we bring the extended family members because we have a list of who the extended family members in that family circle is, and we have them take the police, if they feel that they need it, to go into the home. And before we even go, that's the first step that our approach in dealing with this type of abuse.
Okay, so you've already thought it out as an organization and you have a little bit of a plan in place. Thank you. Anybody else? What if you're just a friend? What if you don't work for an organization?
I personally would have reacted immediately by calling police. The moment there is an aggression, the evidence of an aggression, there's no question as to what I do in this case.
Okay, so I think that's a valid response. Somebody's been injured. Does anybody have a different view on that, though?
Okay, so Peter told me to get the mic and go to where the people are. So you just have to put your hand up. I always do what Peter tells me.
Very good.
A lot of older people here.
I obey, Peter.
My initial reaction, I know the police would need to be involved or should probably be involved. My initial reaction was my friend and I had the car there and stuff. I would probably try and say, I'm really scared for you. Come on with me. Like he's in the background, come on with me, let's get in my car. That's what my initial reaction.
That's what you would do, okay. Others? Okay, this is working.
Oh, come on!
Sorry. Hi. I think my initial reaction is that I would ask her if there's anything I could do right then and there if she wanted me to call the police, or I don't know how terrified she is. I don't know if she wants me to intervene at any time, but I would probably just ask her instead of just saying, call me. Because I won't know what's going to happen within those minutes that I leave.
Right.
Yeah, but if there's anything I could do then and there, I'd like her consent, probably. I'm not sure.
Okay. Others? Other thoughts?
Okay, somebody pick this one up and come to this side of the room.
I just want to piggyback on what that lady just said in the sense that you don't want to escalate the situation also, because the minute that she closes that door, he could assume that she had that woman coming on purpose and checking in on her. And so you have to keep in mind that she has to tell you what she wants done as well. So you want to help and you don't want to be a bystander, but you're also put in a really uncomfortable position and not wanting to make the situation worse for her.
Other thoughts?
The police officer in me wants to take her out of there immediately, because you know if you shut that door, anything could happen, and you couldn't live with yourself if something happened there. The friend in me would want to either get her out or get me in there, just to let him know that somebody else knows that it's not a secret anymore. Mm-hmm. To talk or whatever. So it kind of like there's two parts to it for me. Protection of her, and let him be there, let him stress, let him break every piece of furniture in the house if he wants to, but not break her.
Thank you.
I guess historically and even in cinema, there's some famous scenes, including in Godfather 1, where Sonny's, the Godfather-to-be's sister, is being beaten up. And in the end, although she begs him not to do anything about it, It'll only make trouble, it'll make things worse. He goes and fixes this guy out on the street with the old threat, if you ever touch my sister again, you'll be dead. It's interesting that, those kinds of things were how some families dealt with that, who chose to get involved, was to escalate violence. Sad to say, though, that there are, when families do want to get involved, a lot of shouting, a lot of things that really don't make a situation better. However, I've found both in running a shelter for many years, as well as having to do with the perpetrator, that when any strength is shown to the perpetrator, he folds his deck really quickly. Often he's feeling hopeless and marginalized and depressed, and the only one he can control is her. And if someone comes along who absolutely shows no fear, he goes back to his default setting again. And I think that says a lot about the shape the perpetrator's in. So to go into the house, what he's saying, tell them to go away in this clip, can be dicey. On the one hand, it does indeed say the secret's out now, it's not behind closed doors. On the other hand, someone would have to be very, very mindful that they could in fact be a source for momentary intimidation, which would cause him to de-escalate. But it's when you leave the house, or if she flees, when she comes home, that he's powerful again. So I think it's very important how you handle that intervention.
Thank you.
I think the thought, we did the French adaptation of this video, and there was a lot of discussion in the group. And part of it is, you have a lady that's coming to the door, and she's on the other side of the door, and this lady could walk out. One of the things you could tell the lady, do you want to come with me, silently. And there's something about this lady that's saying, I'm in trouble, but I need to go back in. Because there could be, she could also walk out. And it all depends on how you want to read that message. I don't think there's a right or wrong either, because I think when you do something by your gut, you have a certain feeling when you're standing in front of someone. You may want to call the police, it may be the right thing, because you feel that way. But there's something about the message in this lady saying, don't make the situation worse. It could be read that way also, saying, I need to go back, not now, because maybe she's not ready to because once you make a really big move, sometimes it escalates things, sometimes people aren't ready to go there. So I think that there was two ways of looking at that as well.
Okay, thank you, Sarita. We'll have one last comment over here.
I just think that from a professional perspective, I would hope that we would have some knowledge prior to going to that door, at least some history. And so that might change our approach of what we would choose to do at the door. From being a friend who hopefully has some insight into your friend's personal life, that you might also have that perspective, but maybe have already hopefully found some opportunity to learn about resources and those types of things in the community to support your friend. So I think the approach could be quite differently. And as a professional, I've been at that door. So.
Okay, thank you. No, it's
not easy, yes.
Not easy. We all, I think that's probably a consensus of the room, not easy. I think there's always going to be a different standard in terms, if you're a professional at the door, it's much clearer choices. We're working in this more nebulous area where you're not a professional, or at least you're not there in your role as a professional. You're there as a friend. I think the choices are more difficult. And I don't have the answer any more than anybody in this room has the answer, but I'm going to recall the triangles that Margaret was working with, the response to troubled triangles, and where we don't want to take over from somebody, right? We don't want to do for them, because that's just replicating that dynamic of abuse. But at the same time, where there's a real safety concern, a safety issue, we do move a little bit more over to that side of doing for a person. So I think that as a framework for looking at this and for making decisions, certainly there's safety concerns here that we have to be very aware of. We really have to think of. There's also the concern about this woman's autonomy. And that's the line that we're always, always walking here, is where do we, what is the decision we make between safety and autonomy? Where do we draw that line? Where do we move towards? But I think we can all see that it's not an option just to walk away and do no follow-up and do nothing. We may all have a slightly different response to that, but we would all certainly do something. Peter and April, did you have any last thoughts about that? I'm doing another scenario, yeah.
I'll wait for the next scenario.
You wait for the next scenario, okay. So we're going to see quite a different scenario now.
Hey, Mom, I'm waiting.
I'm coming. Your father's always been so particular about his teeth.
You gonna invite her in this time? Or are they just gonna stand out there with the coats on like a couple of strangers? The old man's just was his voice. I told him to stay where he had all he can take. I'm ready for you. I'm trying to be yours.
Oh, it's so good to see you both.
I don't know why you still don't talk to him like that. You should have left him years ago.
She's stronger than that, aren't you, Mom? Are you sure you can't stay? I can make you something easy.
You wanna go? Let him go. Good for nothing. The three of you.
Ah!
Oh, Christ. Could you have made it any farther? What's wrong with you?
Oh! I'm sorry,
We literally just stopped by to say hello. If they're right.
Well, don't wait so long between visits. We never see you.
I know. Life happens, you know? That was fun. Still want to get that drink? Oh, yeah.
Okay, you got the mic, Margaret? Does anybody want, what do we see in this scenario? What are the dynamics that we saw?
I just see a lot of pain and a lot of sorrow from everybody. Like, this one really wells me up inside, because from the mother, from the father, from the kids, it's like so much pain across a family that clearly something's been happening for quite a long time, and in a really poor dynamic that's not going to get anybody to a healthier, happier, more well place without having the tools and resources and capacity to be able to do things differently.
There's somebody here.
Thanks. The emotional element was a great place to start with the pain, because it's something that everyone experiences, whether you're a perpetrator or whether you're a bystander or the victim. Some things I specifically saw was the mom was in denial of, the victim, the older mother was in denial of what was going on. She was not responding to what was being told, or she was just not acknowledging it. The father was perpetrating various forms of I don't know if you call that physical violence, dumping hot tea on her and telling her that it's not good enough. The son was kind of being a passive bystander in a way, as well as the wife of the son, and the wife was reinforcing the passive bystander behavior. And then as they were leaving, the comment about alcohol, because of course this is a specific, everything in this video is designed for a reason, is my assumption. Could be an element of substance abuse, because the reference to alcohol, because it could be a coping mechanism for the situation that they don't know how to handle.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Anybody else have any observations? What are we seeing in this little short clip, essentially? If you think about those typologies that were presented about forms of domestic violence, I think we're seeing something very specific here. Anybody want to comment?
Annalie? That's your side of the room, Annalie, just saying.
I'm coming.
One of the things that I think that they talked about was they said you should have left him years ago, which shows that there's been a history of domestic violence that's been ongoing.
Exactly. So this is a case of domestic violence grown old. It's been happening for a long time. Yeah. So how would we
I also wanted to point out that they were also putting all of the defending up to the mother. They weren't, it didn't even seem like they felt that it was their position to even think about stepping in and trying to help her. They were leaving it all up to her, and I feel like that's something that is not very fair to do.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. Okay, we have somebody else who wants to make a comment about that.
Sorry, I just wanted to comment on what this woman said just now, that they look like they just kind of left the mother there, but from the look in their eyes, it seems that for years they've been dealing with this, and they know that the mother won't leave, and there's nothing more they could do about it. That's what I got from it.
Okay.
I wouldn't know if I'd be any different. I mean, seeing that clip, you don't want them to leave their mother in that situation. You want them to take her out of that situation. But if you've dealt with this, if you've witnessed your mother go through this for years and years and she still won't leave him, there's really not much you could do at that point.
Okay, somebody else has got a comment here.
I think if we go back to what we were just talking with Peter, there's the history of previous abuse. There's also the fact that she's the caretaker for that gentleman. So leaving for her is probably not an option. Like, we don't know how long he's been in that state, but there's a dynamic there too.
Absolutely.
But yeah, there are a few indicators of risk there, for sure.
For sure. There's indicators of risk, and there's also a sense of her being trapped by her caregiving role. Yeah, thanks. Allison?
Hi, thanks. The one thing I wanted to just piggyback on one of the earlier comments was those kids grew up in that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they grew up watching that probably happen to their parents. So do they see what's happening? Do they see how it affected them? So I think it also, I hadn't really thought about that before, but I think it really does speak to the multi-generational impacts of domestic violence.
I think it's important also to note that when we work with this scenario, we're not expecting these kids to be the ones to interrupt what's happening. They're part of the dynamic. It'll be the neighbors, friends, and family members outside of this immediate circle that we'll be talking about. So if you're a friend of this family, right, what might you do?
Margaret, there's another comment over here.
I'm sorry, I have the mic now.
Okay.
I just think that there's something really important about language, of course, when we're talking about anything to do with family violence in particular. So often we hear about caretaker, caregiver, and now a newer terminology being the care partner. And I think that it's really important for us to sort of, as practitioners, to think about the differences of that language when we're even speaking in regards to family violence. Because I do think that there's quite a difference in the terminology.
Okay, thank you. So, okay.
And the one other thing that, thanks for saying that I just wanted to add is, I guess when I hear that language, like, I take very seriously the presentation that Peter did that talked about the role of, men who are now caregivers that have not been in that role. I think that's really, really key. But I keep thinking back to one of the women who had a big impact on my life in the violence against women field, who said, "Is someone a caregiver if they're beating you up?"
Good point. Thanks, Allison. So what we're seeing as a result of these years and years of domestic violence, the dynamics of domestic violence, is a family that's really isolated and individuals within the family that are really isolated. So we're seeing really profound social isolation. So if somebody we're really coming to the end of our time.
You've got the red light. Let me look. You stop the clock. Okay.
But just quickly, I wanted to give our panelists a chance to comment on both of the scenarios. And I guess the point about this one is that Somebody over here said, you know, those kids, they've been watching that for years. They're not going to be the ones to be able to intervene. But there are definitely other people connected to different people in that family that knows what's going on. And they're the ones that have to find a way to start to break that isolation, right? We're not going to resolve a whole situation that's decades old in a single conversation. But if we can begin to surface what's the situation, if we can begin to acknowledge the risks and talk about the risks, and if we can stop leaving everybody so alone trying to deal with it, I think that would be the best that we could hope to do. Peter, did you want to?
Just briefly, I heard lunch is really good, and we're 5 minutes over. But two brief points. One is, we have to go beyond knowledge to skill building. So, I mean, these are both very difficult dilemmas, but it's one thing to have the theory, it's another thing to actually role play and practice, whether you're a professional, a friend, a child, adult child in the circumstances, really be important to think through strategy. And the other thing is, even in having this group discussion, like, I think each of us there's some really good ideas. Together, there's a brilliant plan when you hear 5 or 6 different voices. So one of the things that I always do in these situations, even though I've been at this for 40 years, I always call a friend or call a colleague. So it's so important to consult and process what you're going to do. And I just think there's so much power in the group. Important reminder, call a friend.
Thank you. April?
I echo, of course, what Peter says. But I'm also brought back to your presentation about is this a potential for a murder-suicide or a homicide of some kind? If not now, then as things go down the road.
Yes. So these are the things we have to think about. We have to recognize the warning signs, recognize the risk factors, understand the risk factors. We have to be able to have conversations, not just with the people we're concerned about, but with each other. Thank you very much.
So thank you, everyone, for your really thoughtful participation in that conversation. So this is one of the video clips that we're still working on, what the facilitation in the neighbors, friends, and families as bystanders context might be. And I took copious notes, and we'll be looking at the videotape, I'm sure, because just based on Peter's comment about calling a friend or the power of the number of ideas in a group, I think you've given us lots of things to think about. So thank you all for that. So again, just acknowledgement of our panel. And so now enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you back at 1:15. Thank you.
Good job.